Hi, and welcome to episode 12 of the Good Bloke, Not Woke podcast. This time I'm going it alone, and maybe this podcast will be a little bit serious, but I've had some things that have been on my mind. And sometimes when you've got things on your mind, it's just worth talking about them. Now, I've got to start by saying that I really do trust that humanity is evolving in a good direction. Sometimes it's not linear, and it's clumsy and it's awkward, and sometimes it looks like it's going backwards. But I do believe that it is evolving and things are growing and things will get better. But when it comes to a world like the one we live in, there's lots of things we look at and we think, man, are we really going down that path? Lots of controversy this last couple of weeks with the Olympic Games and controversies around the gender of some boxers. And I know I've got my perspectives on that, and you might have yours. But sometimes things that appear to be settling into a culture are just trends. They come along and then they go. A little bit like O-bikes, like treads, like punk rocker gangs, Wu-Tangers, whatever, these things, that they come, they stay for a while and they move on, and society grows and evolves. So it's fine. So maybe we shouldn't get too caught up on some things. But I talk on this podcast about having a moral compass, and I talk about a moral compass as having a very strong sense of what you believe is right and what you believe is not right, and being able to feel that in the moment. And then I talk about healthy masculinity, and that is having the courage to follow that moral compass and speak up. So why am I talking today? Well, I'm concerned. I'm a student of the world. I'm very, very interested in geopolitics and the happenings of the planet, what's going on in the greater planet Earth. And right now, I've got a lot of attention on the US election. And you think, well, why would an Australian have so much attention on US politics? Well, the reality is there's an election coming up. And, when America sneezes, Australia catches a cold and the rest of the world starts to shiver. So it's important. But I can't have an influence on the election because I don't get to vote. And the funny part about it is, in America, people don't have to vote if they don't want to. Whereas here in Australia, we have to vote. It's a legal requirement. And I value my opportunity to place my vote. So right now I'm looking at what's going on over there and I think, is this craziness? Really? What's happening to this incredible country, this great country? What's really going on over there, and how can I help? Now, on the weekend, I was in regional New South Wales and southern Queensland, and I was in some small towns and I was looking at what was going on around the towns. And I was contemplating the difference between small town living and big city living. And I've lived in small towns in my life, so I know experientially what it's like. And I realized that when you're away from the city, things slow down a little bit. You've got more time to connect with people. There's more friendliness and neighborliness, people helping each other out, spending time together. Whereas in the city, it's a little different. It's more expensive to live. It's a little more fast paced. There's a lot of time spent commuting. People have got pressures. Often workplaces are competitive. And so, people are playing this game of a frenetic game that's very heavily weighted on whether their mind can cope with what's going on and whether they can survive mentally, intellectually, and I guess emotionally in this environment. And part of the challenge of that, and part of what, the big city can sort of celebrate, is that part of our development as human beings can be sort of waylaid. And some of the things we really do need to work on, we miss the opportunity to work on. Perhaps because everybody else has got attention on themselves and what they need to do, and we're not spending much time helping each other and correcting each other. And so this interpersonal connection sort of drops off and becomes a little bit superficial. People experience a lot of stress. A term that's carrying through right now big time is burnout, and people blaming their workplace for their stress levels and being overcooked and basically, crashing. experiencing anxiety attacks and panic attacks and those sorts of things. But part of what misses in this stretch is the growth of our sense of what is right and what is not right, this development of a strong moral code. Now, developing a strong moral code requires a lot of mistakes, takes a lot of correction, it takes a lot of humiliation, because sometimes we do dumb shit. Other people help us, we correct it, we get rejected, we make mistakes, and we grow and we evolve through that. But if we haven't got people around us who've got attention on us to coach us through that and support us through that, well, then we can go decades with no real attention on evolving that part of ourselves. But you see, when we don't grow that part of ourselves, it leaves an emptiness. And in our heart somewhere, we know that we have not developed the capacity to be a moral person. And somehow that arcs a reaction in us that tells us that we have to show the world that we are a moral person. And the quickest path to that is to jump upon some cause and become a supporter of that cause, become a cheer squad. It can be the environment, it can be something like Black Lives Matter, it can be the Indigenous voice to Parliament, it can be trans rights. There's so many different causes. There are emotive causes that people can get very head up about and start to wave their arms around and be big supporters. And basically what's happening is they're signaling their synthetic virtue to the world that, hey, look at me, I'm a really moral person. And I noticed this a lot during the Indigenous voice to Parliament, because a lot of what people were telling me just didn't make sense. And I grew up in a region where there's a lot of Aboriginal people, and I've been back there and I've done work in in areas where there's a lot of Australian Indigenous people, spent a lot of time talking with them. And I've got friends who've worked closely in those areas as well. And one of the things that I feared most of all with that referendum was that if it passed, it may well sentence Australian Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, to be victims for the rest of time. And I know that setting somebody up to be a victim is a way to remove all their power and slowly degrade them as human beings. The only cause that I will ever support is personal responsibility. So developing a moral code is hugely important. And it's for our sense of self, our self-acceptance, and our spiritual growth as human beings, and our path to self-actualization. Virtue signaling is a side path that takes you into dark places. And you see, I'm seeing this right now because I'm watching what's happening in the US election. And I'm sitting outside that country looking in, and I do visit the country quite often. And I'm asking myself, what are people really thinking? Now, the interesting thing is to look at the two dominant sides of politics. There's in America, they have the Republicans. In Australia, we have the Liberal and National parties. And on the other side of politics in America, you have the Democrats, and in Australia, it's the Labor Party. So the Republicans are on the right and the Democrats are on the left. And for decades, most of the people within those parties were fairly moderate. So there was differences in philosophy, but it wasn't extreme. But over time, things have changed. And it seems that there's change occurring that people are not paying attention to. And I'm really interested in this because I feel that we could be stepping into some dark times if we don't really pay attention. Now, if I look in from the outside and somebody said to me, what's America's biggest problems? Well, I would say number one, they're losing trust all over the world because of wars that perhaps should never have been. We all know about the weapons of mass destruction that never existed. A whole war consuming trillions of dollars was based on a lie. Now we see a war in Ukraine where America's not actually fighting, but they're funding one side of the war to the tunes of billions and billions of dollars. And I ask myself, why is that war even running? Because it's clear that all Russia wants is for NATO to stay away. But we've got this ongoing chant that's happening, and it seems to be that the Democratic Party that used to be the party of compassion and peace and taking care of the battler, taking care of the worker, taking care of the underdog, has all of a sudden stepped into this realm where it's funding wars, and it's the party of the elite and the universities. It's all about the greatness of the Democratic Party, and the traditional base seems to have been left behind. The worker seems to be being completely ignored. And I wonder about supporters of the Democratic Party, and are they asking the question, what's happening here? What's changing here? And the reality is that the country's broke. The taxes that Americans pay don't even fund the interest on the foreign debt, and still the spending continues. Huge amounts of money housing illegal immigrants, spending money on these wars. And then the next part is the health of the US. Once considered the most incredible nation on the planet, strong, healthy, powerful people, we used to be in awe of watching the Americans at the Olympics. I mean, it's almost a fable of the fact that as a kid growing up, I looked at Bruce Jenner and looked at him and thought, man, what a Superman. He's amazing. And now he's a woman. Probably says a lot. But what's really happening to the consciousness of the American voter? Because if we go even further, we realize something that's been growing behind the scenes and nobody's paying attention. When I was at school, I studied economics. And one of the fundamental laws of economics that we studied at the time was that monopolies are no good. Monopolies are dangerous. Too much power. Well, whilst you can't pick one industry and say that company has a monopoly or this company has a monopoly, what's sitting behind is the massive equity funds that now own 85 to 90% of the Fortune 500. And these massive organizations, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they own so much, and especially BlackRock, they own companies, they own the media, they are huge donors to political parties, and basically they control everything. And regular citizens just stand back and watch it all happen. And the problem is, if you have that much power, then you can dictate what gets printed in the press, what gets aired on television, and you can align it with the favorable policies in government. For example, a lot of you might disagree with me on this, but I look at the environment, for example. Now, I went from this thing of, first off, we used to worry about how the Amazon rainforest was being destroyed. And on my last podcast, I talked about that with Yossi Ginsberg. Yossi knows the Amazon intimately. But then all of a sudden it shifted and everything became about carbon in the atmosphere. And now we talk about global warming and everything's just about global warming. And then now everything's moved to just climate change. And we throw the term climate change around like everybody understands fundamentally what it means. Well, do we? Really? What is it? If we compare the climate today to what it was 5 years ago, yeah, it's changed. It seems to be a bit different. We haven't had any of that. We haven't had the hot weather that we had in Melbourne in 2010, where we had 5 days in a row up around 45, 46, 47 degrees before the terrible bushfires. We haven't had that since then. So you'd say, wow, the climate's changed. But do you look at the climate over a 100-year trend, 500 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years? I learned recently that we are actually still coming out of the last ice age. We're not out of an ice age yet people are talking about global warming. So let's go back to carbon for a moment. I often ask people, how much carbon is there in the atmosphere? And only one person has ever been able to answer the question. I'm quite amazed by that. It's 400 parts per million, which is 1/25th of 1%. And you think, wow, that's insignificant. Some people have said to me figures like, carbon's 60% of the atmosphere and it's growing. 1/25th of 1%, 400 parts per million. When dinosaurs roamed the earth, it was 3,000 parts per million, and the earth wasn't burning up. It was very, very green. because carbon is plant food. And it is true that the carbon level has risen a little bit from about 380 to 400 parts per million in the last 40 years. And as a result of that, the Earth is now 15% greener than it was in 1980. So where's the problem in all that? Well, Bjorn Lomborg, the great Danish environmentalist, said, yep, well, it might warm up a little bit. And that could be a problem for some people. But he said a lot less people are going to die because of extreme cold. Humans adapt slowly over time. But you see, because the narrative of climate change has become so accepted and it's been jumped on board by so many people, especially in the cities, people looking for a cause that they can jump on to tell people how moral they are, and virtues signal themselves all the way to their grave, perhaps, that these big companies have latched on to the political parties that are buying into this trend because they can get votes, and that way they can get them to spend money. So now governments are spending trillions of dollars of public money, and these massive corporations are vacuuming it up. And so we're seeing wind farms popping up everywhere. Wind farms that are very, very, very questionable in terms of their output of electricity compared to the resources that go into building them. And, once you put one of those windmills up, it's not going to last forever. The blades, which really could cover nearly an entire soccer pitch, they have a life expectancy of maybe 28 years, and they are completely non-recyclable. So when they come down, somebody's got to do something with them. And right now, there's over 3 million of them in use across the planet. So where are we going to put them? Solar panels, how do we recycle those? Batteries, how do we recycle those? And the problem of cobalt in the batteries is an extraordinary problem. I've stopped replacing my mobile phone. I'm going to have to wait till it dies before I replace it again, because I can't ethically buy another battery, because I know that 74% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo, and it's mined under treacherous, cruel slave labor conditions. Between 100 and 1,000 people die on those mine sites every single week. 15-year-old girls with babies on their back digging for cobalt with their bare hands. Where's the people jumping up and down about that? Nobody. It's too convenient. And so we've got these massive monopolies creating all the narrative in our mainstream media and driving an agenda, and people are just too lazy to look under the surface and see what's really happening. And you see, the most powerful person in a market economy is a consumer, because you choose whether you want to buy the product or not. The most powerful person in a democracy is the voter. You choose who you vote for. Now, I get it that many people grow up believing in one side of politics or another. That's completely fine. Me, I've been a swinging voter my whole life, because I tend to look at who's got the policies and who's someone I feel like I can trust to follow through and deliver that policy. Now, sometimes I don't get it right because people change. I was talking to a really good friend the other day who's a real man of the world, and he's had audiences with US presidents and other dignitaries around the world. And he talked about one US president who, just before he took office, he thought, wow, this man is going to be the greatest president of all time. And he said he saw him soon after he took office, and he couldn't believe. He said it had to be a different person. He couldn't believe the change, because power changes people. And he said he turned out to perhaps be the worst president that ever lived. And I agree, because this is what happens. If the voters don't hold their parties accountable, people get into power, and instead of saying, I've been given the right to govern, they say, I'm in power. And when people become addicted to power, and there's a lot of unelected officials who are in positions earning very big pay packets who have incredible power. In Australia, in the US, because governments have become too big, and the government departments have become too big, and there is so much power. And sometimes they're inflicting bad things on humanity, e.g., the US war machine. Another example is what the drug companies have been able to get away with really, really fraudulent, really bad research to get drugs onto the market so that they can vacuum up the money that comes with the sale of those drugs and stand by, turning their heads the other way as people get sick and die from the consumption of those drugs. I mean, it's amazing. I was looking into it the other day, and I learned that in America, because of the capacity of government departments to basically create laws that Congress and the Senate never sees, there are over 300,000 ways in America that a person can become a criminal. Can you believe that? Like, that's astounding. Where have we gone wrong? What would happen if governments ran huge campaigns to inspire people to become good and decent and honest human beings, and in the same campaigns inspired us to help each other to become good and decent human beings? I look at Australia, and we have these speed cameras everywhere, and people are getting booked and being fined $150 or $200 for going 3 kilometers an hour over the speed limit. It's so profoundly mindless. I just shake my head. And, I thought if ever I went into government, and I won't, and so I've got to be careful how much I criticize because I'm not prepared to do the job. But if ever I did, the very first thing I would do is I would get rid of all of that, and I would leave the speed cameras there, and I would wipe off all the outstanding fines, and I would say to the electorate, right, from here on in, we're not going to do that stuff. But what I want you all to do is to work with each other and become more responsible drivers, become more courteous, take care of each other on the road, be mindful, and keep a campaign going, reminding people of those things. And then if somebody does get caught doing 20 kilometers an hour over the speed limit, well then, okay, you lose your license for a couple of years until you learn how to drive properly again. You lose the privilege of driving. But fining people for 3Ks over the speed limit, man, it's gotten draconian. So back to America. What's happening over there? I look at it and I think, where is at least some honesty, or even some pretending to be honest? I was speaking to a very dear friend of mine in 2020, and she is a close personal friend of the current US president. And she said to me back then, 5 months before the election, the president, she said, he's senile. I don't know why he's running for president. So she knew back then. But all this time, especially over the last 18 months, we've time and time again, leaders of the Democratic Party, all of the mainstream media, all of the commentators have been telling us with so much earnestness that there's nothing wrong with the president, that he's as clear as a bell and he's as sharp as a tack. Even a few days before he pulled out of the race for president, his vice president was continuing that lie. She was looking into the lens of TV cameras and lying to the American people, telling them that she'd been with the president just in the last few days and he was sharp as a tack. Just lying. Now, we all know that politicians struggle with the truth, but it's a little different to just unleashing a bold-faced lie over and over and over again. The leaders of your party. And somehow American Democrat voters think that's completely okay. It was, don't worry about that. But you see, it is the job of the party faithful, when the party goes off, and a Democratic party that's funding so much war, that's getting into so many things that are unhelpful for the economy and for the republic and for people, funding all of these 22 million illegal immigrants over the last 4 years, putting them up in hotels when some American citizens can't even pay their bills. The party faithful, the Democratic Party, should be saying, I'm not voting for you this year. You need to pull your head in. You've lost your way. That's the way you get your political parties to correct themselves. You don't vote for them. But you see, there's a challenge as well, because part of what's been done, because these big equity companies want the left-leaning parties in power, because they're the parties that support this environmental push. They're the parties that are going to spend money on environment stuff. So they want them in power. So now through this legacy media, they've got this constant push. And part of the message that's being pushed is that the other side, the Republicans, the message that's being pushed is if they get into power, they're going to rig the system and they're never going to leave. And it's going to turn into a horrible dictatorship. I look at that and I think, how would that even be possible? That's not possible. The American system, the Constitution is very, very good. And the system is set up in a way that that can't happen. Like it couldn't happen here in Australia. Even if somebody really wanted to do it, they couldn't do it. But I can't believe the blind faith with which people are following that. I was sitting next to a young guy on a plane the other day, and he was from San Diego, and he's just been in Australia for 2 weeks because his wife was over here working. So he came over for a holiday to spend some time with her. And I said, I was talking about the US election. He said, well, the problem is, though, that if Trump wins the election, that's it. We'll never get him out. He's a tyrant and he's going to become a dictator and he'll change the system so that we can't get rid of him. And I said, wow, where did you hear that? Like, it was the most obtuse thing I've ever heard. But I've heard it a few times. And I thought, man, have you looked beyond that? Where did you read that? Did you see that in the newspaper? Did you hear it on TV? Have you looked behind? Did you actually sit down and watch the interview, the face-to-face interview that Trump did with Dr. Phil? Different human being. And one of the things that Trump really caught my attention in that interview was, and, I'm not saying I love Trump. I think, as a man, his disrespect for women, I think that's very concerning. But also, we've got to allow people to grow and evolve too. So I've never met the man. I don't know what he's like. But one of the things he did say is that when asked about the war, he just said, do you know how many people are dying over there right now? He said the male population, the young male population of Ukraine is being wiped out. And there's so many young Russian men dying as well. And he said, I'm going to stop that war. I'll stop it within a week. And I have no doubt that he will. But you see, this comes back to the Democratic voters again. They are supporting that war. They have to be, because 2 months after that war started, Germany and France brokered a deal between Ukraine and Russia, and they signed a peace deal. And the US government, in cahoots with the English government, sent Boris Johnson in there, and they smashed the deal. They tore it up because they wanted that war to keep going. Now, you might think that's absurd, that will never happen. Well, it did happen, and it's documented. So where do you stand as a Democratic voter? Because you are basically saying it's okay for all those people to be dying every week. It's okay for the Ukrainian population to be decimated, because without young men, where are they going to get their childbirths from? What's going to happen to that country? It's being destroyed. It's being destroyed under your watch. Now, you might, in your blueprint, you might just be, to vote Republican for you might be just such a reprehensible thought that you can't do it. But that's okay, because the thing that amazes me is that the Democrats have got a profoundly good lifelong Democrat candidate, and they've blocked him at every turn because they don't like what he stands for, because he is all for taking the power away from these big equity funds. He's all for cleaning up the mainstream media by taking away the power of those equity funds. He's also for cleaning up medicine and cleaning up, what the drug companies are doing. And he doesn't want to create more laws. All he said is, hey, I will commission the proper research to test all of those drugs. And if the research proves there's been fraud, we'll let the lawyers handle the rest of it. Wow, brilliant. And he too said, day one, I'll stop that war. And his name's Bobby Kennedy, probably the most loved political family in the history of America. But through their powers in the mainstream media, they've created this narrative that he's a lunatic. He's an anti-vaxxer. Man, where are intelligent people doing their research? See, I'm on the outside. I'm interested. Sometimes in my life, I've I've lent towards the Democrats. Other times I've lent toward the Republicans. You know, the philosophy of the left side of politics is collectivism. That basically means we decide what's best for society, we'll make those rules and you all follow. The right side of politics, their basic philosophy is freedom of choice, freedom of enterprise. That means it's up to you as an individual to make your own decisions and make your way. And hopefully, if you're a moral person, you'll do it really well. If you're an immoral person, you might cause some destruction. But that's up to all of us to help each other. I like that idea because the only cause I will ever champion is personal responsibility. And that brings us back again to this development of a strong and robust moral compass. And then asking ourselves if we've got the courage to live by it. So here we are right now. We're facing down on this election. It's not far away, less than 3 months. What are we all going to do? What are you going to do as Americans? Are you going to snap yourself out of your blind faith for your party and ask yourself the question, who is going to lead our country into a bright future? And who is using power badly for the benefit of a few? Because over the last few years, the amount of money that's moved upwards out of the middle class and made the rich richer, and the shrinking of the middle class in America, the shrinking of so many parts of the economy like manufacture that's put everything back in the hands of China. America's created dependence. It's not smart business because nobody's been defending the workers. What are you going to do? You're going to look into your heart, feel your biases, ask yourself why you have such a bias, and stop. You're going to ask yourself, have I really developed a strong moral compass, or am I just signaling virtue to make myself look good? Now, none of this means you're a bad person or anything like that, but we all need to take the opportunity to grow. We all need to evolve and develop ourselves. Me too. I've done some shitty things in my life, but I've learned lessons from them and I've gotten better, and I'm sure I've got more to learn. I'm sure some of you'll have feedback about this podcast that I might like or I might not like. That's okay. It's all good. We've got to be able to share our perspectives, but we've got to break down the mobs. You know, seriously, do you want to be an independent being who lives their life from the truth that lies in their heart, or do you just want to be part of somebody's mob? Do you want to be on the environment mob? Do you want to be on the Black Lives Matter mob? Do you want to be on the trans mob? Do you want to be on the Marxist mob? Do you want to be on the white supremacist mob? What do you want to do? Or do you want to just stand up and go, hang on a minute, what do I need to do right now? Really, let's look at this. Do I want to stick with a party that's been lying through its back teeth? Do I want to buy a newspaper that's been telling me one-sided story for the last 20 years? Do I want to continue to believe things when something inside me says, maybe that's not right? Do you want to start subscribing to some alternative media? Find the real journalists. Go and find them. Who are the real journalists out there? You know, Barry Weiss, for example, an amazing Democrat voter, New York Times journalist. All of a sudden she got fired because she pushed outside the narrative. Now she's got this amazing organization online, the Free Press, where you actually get to hear from dedicated journalists who just want to uncover what's real and present that. Are you up for that? Because there's lots to learn. And, we can all do better, because right now the world needs all of us to start being more conscientious and more sincere in our own perspectives. What do we really want? Do we want more of the same? Do we want to just be part of the band that's loyal to our party, like a football supporter? Or do we want to stand up and take some leadership and start opening up the conversations with our friends? Start having civil discussions with people who believe differently to us and hear their perspective and share yours, and get curious about why they think the way they do. Because if you're not prepared to do that, well, unfortunately, you're just a judgmental git. And that's all there is to it. And nobody likes being labeled that, but that's true. I don't want that for anybody. I want us all to open our minds up, open our hearts, and really make some decisions, because right now the world needs it. I hate the thought of America being reduced to nothing, but that's what could happen, because there's so much trust being breached all over the world, too many wars, too much domination by pharmaceutical companies and military companies, and none of that's good for America. None of that's good for humanity. So you might say to me, if you're in America, who would you vote for? I think I'd vote for Bobby Kennedy. I just really like what he's about. And if you really haven't tuned in to listen to what he's got to say, well, tune into some of his interviews. He's done some good ones. Jordan Peterson, with Dr. Phil. He's been on Joe Rogan. Listen to what the guy says. He's a pretty good dude. But anyway, you've got to make up your own mind. Thanks for tuning in. Keep growing, keep evolving, and keep, sharing this podcast if you think it's worthwhile. And let's see if we can all work together to bring more compassion, more kindness, more generosity, more gratitude, and more selflessness into our societies, so that we can help each other to become better people. And when we do that, the payoff is going to be in the kids that are coming up, because they are going to have more openness and more freedom to discover who they are, less reason to rebel, and more of a desire to live a great life. So thank you for tuning in to the Good Bloke Not Woke podcast, and I'll see you all soon.